Hello, everybody. My name's Nick French, and I am the communications coordinator for Deep Sea Consulting. I'm really happy that you all are showing up today at 11 a.m. Central Time for Sarah Seeing the Difference webinar. It's a little bit more condensed version of her full seminar, but with all of the same information, which means that we'll be moving at a really interesting and almost a quick pace. So if you have any questions, feel free to send those to me via chat or email. The chat is here in the GoToWebinar control panel. Otherwise, I will drop my OLAS at deepseaconsulting.com. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to send those onward to me, and I'll be sending those to Sarah when it comes time for questions. I will now kind of read through a quick little bio of Sarah. So for over 2 decades, Sarah Taylor has been helping organizations and the individuals within them to be more effective and inclusive through her engaging diversity and inclusion trainings, comprehensive leadership development programs, and innovative cultural competence frameworks. For the past 15 years, as the founder and president of Deep Sea Consulting, she's worked with HR managers, chief diversity officers, and high-level execs at numerous companies. And she's also an author of a new book, Filter Shift: How Effective People See the World. And that book explores how our unconscious is actually making choices and decisions for us, all without our knowing, and how to change that. We'll be dipping into that a little bit today, but without further ado, I am going to hand this over to Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. I'm going to start showing my webcam too, so that folks can see me as I go. I know that after one of my very first webinars that I did years ago, and someone that had seen me present live, and then they saw the webinar and they said, we just really got to see you as you're doing this. So I'm going to show my webcam as we go to. Really excited to be able to, those of you that are joining us live, to have you join us live. We also know that many of you are going to be seeing this archived. We typically will send out this particular webinar. We had an older version, typically send out this webinar for folks that are just getting the IDI assessment, wanting an introduction to cultural competence. So we know that there's some of you that will be taking this in an archive as well. So what are we here to do today? Why are we gathered? We want to take a look at this notion of cultural competence and start with the question of why. I mean, why should we care about cultural competence? Why should this be something that we should be spending our time on? We want to also talk about strategies that we can each take on depending on the stage of development that we're in. How do we move to the next most effective stage? And then finally, the benefits. What have other organizations seen? What have other individuals seen as they have developed their competence? I'm going to start with a question that we start with actually many times in our training sessions. Nick mentioned that this is very similar to a program that we do live in instructor-led training. And one question that we ask quite a bit, we start with this of what does diversity create in your organization? And we ask folks to be real candid and think of everything that comes to their mind, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we hear all kinds of responses, everything from the positive and the negative. So the negatives of chaos and conflict, confusion, misunderstanding, to very positive, like innovation, opportunity, new ideas, and growth. And I challenge folks after they go through these, and I'm sure many of you thinking some of the same concepts as well, that this is what diversity creates in our organizations. And just as I challenge those folks in our face-to-face trainings, I'll challenge you to really stop and think about this question again. Does diversity really create these things? I would say that it's not diversity that creates all of those myriad of results and outcomes in our organizations. Yes, it is there, but it's not the diversity, because diversity in and of itself can't create anything. It's just there. It just is. It's something that isn't positive and it's not negative. It just is. Now, in the midst of a diverse workforce, yes, we do have all of those outcomes. So the question then becomes, if it's not the diversity that is creating all of those things, then what is? I would suggest that it's our ability. Not our ability, our technical ability to do our jobs, but our ability to interact with that diversity, our ability to be our most effective selves. In fact, that is our definition of cultural competence, that ability to interact effectively across differences. Now, take my word for it that it's about this ability, or take the word of a researcher. Joe DiStefano, before I get to that, my apologies, I want to lay out that those stages of competence, actually 5 stages of this competence in the model that we're particularly using. So those 5 stages, when we are operating at these lower stages of competence, we don't have that ability to interact effectively across difference. And that is when we're operating down here that we're going to get more of those negative things that we saw on that list of diversity creates, the chaos, the conflict, versus when we're operating in these higher stages of competence, that's when we're going to have the innovation and the growth. So it's about building this competence. Now back to where I was headed earlier, to Joe DiStefano. He asked that same question. What does diversity create? And he took a look at performance in teams that were both homogeneous and diverse. So over here on the left, those teams that were low performing. Over here on the right, those teams that were high performing. And then he plotted out, let's see if there's a difference between the homogeneous and diverse teams. And this is what he found. He might be very surprised to know what these 3 bell curves represent. They represent both diverse and homogeneous teams, diverse teams being the lowest performing teams, and of course, the peak performers, with homogeneous teams as those mediocre teams, the steady eddies, if you will, in the middle. So you can imagine the question that he asked next was, okay, what's the difference between those diverse teams? And you can probably guess it's that answer that I've already given you. It's their ability. And again, that's the ability to do their jobs. Were these the highest performers technically? It was their ability to interact with that diversity on their teams. So it becomes then about really focusing on that ability. Now, let's take a look again at all 3 of those bell curves. I would guess that for the majority of you already, of these 3, one of them is already obsolete, and that's the homogeneous teams. Now, for others of you, it may not be today, but it certainly is going to happen in your workplace very soon, that you will no longer have homogeneous teams in your workplace. So then the question for you is, which of these do you want to be? Which of these do you want your organization to represent? And which of these for you individually, as individuals, where do you want to be contributing? I think most of us would agree we want to be in that high-performing team. Now, we can actually take those 5 stages of competence and plot them out in this framework, this study from Joe DiStefano. If we're operating in those lower 3 stages of ability, we're going to be in that left bell curve. Only when we're operating in the 4th and 5th stages are we going to be in those high-performing teams. So let's dive in just a bit more. We talk about this term of culture, obviously, with our work of cultural competence, but we haven't defined that. So let's just do that. we use a definition from Milton Bennett, who actually created this 5-stage framework, was the first to create that particular framework, later revised by Mitch Hammer. So he talks about culture as shared meaning, experiences, and perspectives. Now, I would think that that is much broader than most of you may have thought of the definition of culture. I think most folks, when they think culture, they think, well, culture is something that I experience when I go to the museum or I go to some kind of festival. That's experiencing culture. And when it's about my culture, well, okay, my culture is about my ethnicity, maybe my national origin. So then I guess for me, that would mean that my culture is that since I'm 4th generation German, Irish, Norwegian, so okay, then that's my culture. I'm German, Irish, Norwegian. Well, we're talking about something so much more complex here. We're talking about so many more groups that are a part of cultural groups, not just our ethnicity, our national origin, or our race. We're talking about our software, essentially, the way we see the world, and how our unconscious creates that. In fact, speaking of the unconscious, this model or graphic really helps us to understand this. And I talk about this quite a bit in my book. The first half of this graphic is what we're typically paying attention to when it comes to diversity. We're typically conscious of those things that are easy to see. So things like you have a new person on your team, and right away you notice their size, the color of their skin, their gender, or at least your perception of their gender, your perception of their beauty, their behaviors, all of that is external. Now, actually, that's a pretty small number of things. What we're talking about as we develop our competence is moving to the level of the unconscious, those things that we're typically not aware of. Our filters formed by our past experiences and stored away in our unconscious that determine our perceptions of everyone that we're interacting with. Our filters that tell us, this is what's respectful, that's what's not respectful. Yet they don't tell us that someone else may have very different filters and may be defining that very differently. So our filters basically dictating for us on a moment-by-moment basis, not only how we're going to see, but also how we're going to respond. As we move in this model, left to right, least to most effective in those 5 stages, we're also moving left to right in this particular graphic. So in the first 3 stages, we're operating here in the level of frames, and only in the last 2 stages are we operating in the level of filters. And you might be surprised to know that in a typical group, a typical workforce, a typical population, the percentage of us that are able to see and respond effectively at the level of filters that are operating in our unconscious, that percentage is only 2.5%. That's really depressing news, I know. But the good news is that any of us can develop this ability. And that's what cultural competence is all about. Let's take a look at those 5 stages and those levels of competence. We're talking here about the intercultural development continuum. Those 5 stages start with denial, then polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. A model that was originally, as I said, created by Milton Bennett, later revised by Mitch Hammer. And all of this underneath his name to refer to the research that he used. And that's so important to point out, because I think particularly in the world of diversity and inclusion, folks will try to poke holes and try to say, well, I don't think that's right. So we really do need to use research-based information, research-based models. I'll just refer to one of the pieces of this, the research that he used, and that was the personal construct theory by George Kelly. So that particular theory essentially says that our unconscious creates our reality. It's my unconscious that's telling me right now how to make sense of the world. And since I don't share the same unconscious with anyone else, I don't know that I'm experiencing things in the same way. I love the George Kelly quote, being in the vicinity of events does not construe experience. Our experiences then can be different because our unconscious filters are taking them in and processing them differently. In addition, they can be very different, our experiences of the same event, because of our stage of development. So I frequently tell the story of my husband is from the Dominican Republic, and I lived there for 4 years. And so we frequently are going back to the Dominican Republic to spend time with his family, all of his family that are still there. And some of those times we're on flights, charter flights, where we've got the same folks that we're sitting next to on the way down as on the way back. And so we kind of strike up conversations with them both ways. And things that I have heard from folks in talking about the differences that they experience. So keep in mind, these folks have the same event, the same week, at the same resorts, many of them going to the same resorts, the same events, but their experience very different. So one that says, when we say, well, how was it? And they'll say, oh, it was so nice. You know, the people were nice. The country was nice. It was just all just nice. And then another person that says, oh, it was just so disgusting and so dirty, and the people were dirty, and oh, I just didn't like it. And then a third that says, wow, I was exhausted, constantly trying to figure out these things are different. What am I supposed to be doing? Their response, their experience of the same event was different because of their stage of development. In fact, that first response of, oh, they were just so nice, that comes from the first stage of denial. The second of, ew, everything was dirty, that comes from the second stage of polarization. And the third of, oh my gosh, I was just so confused. I mean, what do? I see everything that's so different. That comes from the fourth stage of acceptance. So you can really see how this is not so much about the event, the diversity that's in our organizations. It's about the ability. That's what we need to be focusing on. Another piece about this, again, as I've already mentioned so many times, is it is developmental. It's a developmental in how we experience difference in general. So those of you that have taken the IDI assessment, that's the assessment that is attached to this particular model. You can take it and find out exactly where you are on this continuum. Now, when you take that assessment, it's not going to tell you how effective you are with a specific group. How effective are you with women versus men? How effective are you with introverts versus extroverts? Or how much of a racist are you? Are you really a racist or really a racist? Instead, it's going to tell you, in general, how effective are you across any kind of difference? What are you doing with those messages that are coming up from your unconscious? The other piece is that this model is both descriptive as well as prescriptive. So what we're going to do right now is describe each of these stages, but then also give the developmental strategy. How do we move from that particular stage to the next most effective stage? So we're going to start right off, and with each of these, we start off with Gary Larson and the far side because they're fabulous depictions of each of the stages. So the first of denial, and we've got Roy in the diner with pigs and chickens, and he says, well, I guess I'll have the ham and eggs. So oblivious, that's what I like to call this particular stage, oblivious. You see Roy, and you could ask Roy at noon, hey, Roy, what do you think about all these pigs and chickens that are moving into the neighborhood. And he'd say, pigs, chickens, just completely oblivious. In fact, that's what I have heard from some folks that I've talked to that are in this stage. One particular person who said to me, and again, he showed up with his assessment as being in this particular stage. And he said to me, I think it's great, Sarah, that we're doing all this diversity stuff. It's fabulous that we're doing it in our organization, but, I don't really know why, because I'm actually never really around diversity. Now, you might think, well, okay, maybe that's the case. He works in a real homogenous area. Now, here's the additional context. He worked in an urban setting that was incredibly diverse, yet he was missing it because he was in this first stage of development. So clueless to the fact that he was clueless and not even understanding those or even experiencing those easy to see frames. So what do we do for folks that are in this particular stage of development? How do we move them to the next most effective stage? Well, gotta see frames. They've got to be able to take those in. So we start exposing them to frames. We say, hey, why don't you go to the Taste of Many Cultures Festival and eat some baklava and watch some Irish step dancers? That's the kind of thing that folks in this particular stage need to do. Or when they're going to be going and doing just their regular errands, instead of going to their typical grocery store, stopping at the Mexican supermarket and just looking at how are things different? How are the cans of food different? What are the kinds of produce that are different? How do the people look different? How do they communicate differently? Looking at those easy to see differences of frames. In organizations, what would we do for folks in denial? We would have events like a Cinco de Mayo event with a mariachi band and some tamales. And so you might think, oh, okay, well, that's what we need to do then, right? We need to have a bunch of Cinco de Mayo kinds of events. Well, here's the other piece. Typically, only 2.5% of our workforce of any particular group is in this stage. So that's why when we do some of those event kinds of things, you get so many people in the organization that are rolling their eyes and saying, oh, this diversity stuff again. That's why. Because it's like giving a first grade assignment to a fifth grader. All right. Once these folks start to see the frames, then they start to attach a value to them, good or bad, us and them. That is that second stage of polarization, a very judging stage. So here we've got the cavemen making fun of the Neanderthals. Nah, 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 can't make fire, can't make spear. So here, those two dynamics that are happening, I think about it as a balance scale that's out of equilibrium. So you've got us on one side, them on the other, one side's good, one side's bad. So in the worst case scenarios, this is the Ku Klux Klan, the skinheads, or ISIS. I'm guessing you don't have that kind of situation going on, though, in your workplace. So what does it sound like in the workplace? It sounds like folks that may say, well, they're in America. Why should we have to translate these materials? They should be speaking American. Those kinds of comments, or, we can't hire him. I mean, he's way too old, and there's a lot of technology involved in this job. I mean, he's not going to understand technology. So you hear that very surface level judgment and a good, bad, us, them dynamic that's going on. This stage is the one and only of all of the stages that is attached to an emotion, and that emotion is fear. So when you're in situations where fear is turned up, you're going to turn up this stage. You turn up this stage, and what are you going to get? More of this stage. Because if you tell me that my group is bad, what's going to be my natural reaction? I want to defend. I want to say, no, your group is bad. So think about those times when you have been in a group where the leader has been turning up fear, or just the situation in your group in general has been a turn up of the fear. Now, in organizations, that sometimes happens when you have, say, budget cuts, layoffs, and, I used to get along just fine with my colleagues, but now I know one of us is going to get cut. And so it's real easy in the midst of all of that fear to defend me and mine and to point out the bad of my colleague. That's what this dynamic of polarization is all about. The other piece about this is there can only be one winner and the rest are losers, essentially. And so if you're saying good about the them, that means inherently you're saying bad about the us. So I know sometimes, in fact, I just, in one of a group that I was working with and a leader that put out a statement about June and Pride Month and saying basically, so great to be able to support Pride Month. Not saying anything bad about straight folks, but what was the sense that folks took in? That, oh, what, now I'm bad because I'm straight? So it's that sense of there can only be a win-lose and not a win-win. Very much based on kind of that scarcity mentality. Now, important to point out that, just think about this again, as an out of equilibrium balance scale. Now, if it's out of equilibrium, it can look like this, where we're saying, yep, our group is good, our group is up, or our group is bad, and others are good. That can sound like me as a white woman saying, oh my gosh, I just so love Latino family values. I mean, they just really do family well. Us white folks, we've just gotten away from good family values. People probably aren't going to call me a racist, right? But I'm still in this second stage of development because I'm still doing the same thing. I'm still doing that good, bad, us, them, just reversing who's good, who's bad. So how do we move out of this dynamic? We want to equalize that balance scale. And the way we do that is by focusing on commonalities. So what do I have in common with them? That then gets us into this third stage of development where almost all of us are, almost 70% in minimization. We got the cartoon here, Roy inadvertently dooms the entire Earth to annihilation when, in an attempt to be friendly, he seizes their leader by the head and shakes vigorously. So you got Roy here with the best of intentions, and he's definitely messing up because he's focusing on similarity. So what we do here is we hear things like, I'm really proud to say that I'm colorblind. And I say to my Black colleague, it's so great to work with you because when I work with you, I just don't see color. But of course, I don't say to my white colleague, when I work with you, it's so great to work with you because when I work with you, I don't see white. Why is that? Because I've just come developmentally from this stage where I did a good, bad, us, them. I don't want to do that. So let's just pretend we're all us. And so what does that mean? I bring the different into the normal. Well, what's deciding normal for me? My filters. So what we need to be able to see here is while this may be a comfortable stage to be in, it's not effective because it's still being controlled by my unconscious deciding for me what's good, bad, right, and wrong, and all of that under my context. Two reasons why we really get stuck in this stage. One, because we get stuck, what's the evidence of that? 70% of us almost in this stage, and then only about 13% in the next stage. So we get stuck. One reason is because we socialize this stage. It's around us all the time. I'm going to show you some evidence of that with some messages that we've pulled off of social media. The other is because it's a huge developmental leap to move from minimization into acceptance. It really takes a significant mindset shift in knowing what's going on in my unconscious. So one of those examples of ways that we promote this, we socialize this particular stage, is with the golden rule. So the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, That's a fabulous mantra, but it's based on just a teeny tiny assumption, and that is that the whole universe wants to be treated the way I want to be treated. So instead, we want to move to the platinum rule. I want to be able to treat others as they want to be treated. Well, what decides how they want to be treated? Their filters operating in their unconscious. That's why we've got to be able to move to that level where we can start operating at the level of filters. Now, I've got one more story of minimization that I want to tell. It's a fun one. It's a funny one. And it's one that I noticed. It happens quite a bit for us, this kind of situation, for us as a mixed race family. And that is this real discomfort with pointing out differences. And so the first time I noticed it was a number of years ago, and I was at a conference at a convention center. It was a diversity kind of conference. And my husband happened to be there the same day. So my husband, as I mentioned, from the Dominican Republic, is a Black Latino. And so he's there. He was doing some continuing education credits or something that same day at the same convention center. And so I'm on break at this diversity conference, just kind of talking to folks in networking, in the hall. And my husband starts walking towards me from the other end of the hall with 3 white guys, 3 of his civil engineering colleagues from his particular organization. So when I say to the folks next to me, I say, "Oh, here comes my husband." And of course they say, "Which one?" Now, what do you think I'm supposed to say? The one with a little bit darker khaki pants, or the one with a little bit lighter light blue shirt, or just the third from the left. No, I say the Black guy. And when I do, what I get typically is the response of nervous laughter and people that just can't stop laughing as if it's so funny. But I know what's going on is their unconscious is telling them, "Oh my God, she just said Black. She's even married to one and she doesn't know, she's not supposed to say that." That's what happens in this particular stage. So what do we do to move out of this stage? We want to get to the place where we can clearly see our filters. So you would think, okay, well then I need to go around and start seeing the filters of others. Well, counterintuitively, we need to start with ourselves. What are my filters? How are they determining how I see the world? Because I'm not the normal. I am different. And I need to be able to see that and see how my filters are deciding for me and how my filters are judging based on assumptions of similarity. Once I do that, that moves me into that stage of acceptance. But again, before we move there, I wanted to just show you a couple of examples of this stage of minimization that we've pulled off of social media. Of course, they've got the rainbow scarf to show there's some kind of diversity, some kind of difference, but it doesn't matter because we all smile in the same language. Or even from folks that we admire, this from Anne Frank. I can give you all kinds of quotes from modern day folks that we admire that are come from this particular stage of minimization. This I see in schools quite a bit. Of course, you've got a brown egg and a white egg. These kinds of messages are around us all the time. And even at diversity conferences, I hear folks that basically are saying, yeah, it's really, this diversity is something that, if we just focus on our sameness, then, that's what would help us out. So let's take a look at one more quote. And that particular quote, actually, let me show you the quote first before I show you where it comes from. Having employees focus on how they're similar to others can build a foundation for mutual understanding and an appreciation of workplace diversity. Negativity is the result when you focus on differences. Any guesses where that might have come from? You're going to be surprised. It came from a diversity magazine. Now, it's not just this diversity magazine. Every diversity magazine has these kinds of messages. HR magazines promote these kinds of messages. So if even our diversity professionals aren't comfortable talking about differences, how are the rest of us supposed to be comfortable? And how is it, I don't get the sense of this, how is it that we teach about differences by only talking about similarities? It just doesn't make sense. So moving into those last two stages, first of acceptance. You got the crocodile, of course I did it in cold blood, I'm cold-blooded. In this particular stage, we see the complexity at the level of the filters and we don't judge them. A great story from an executive that we moved from she's from a large healthcare organization, and she started out in minimization. We moved her to adaptation, and she talked about this shift into acceptance. And she said, you know, I talk about it like the Wizard of Oz. I was operating thinking, I'm really competent. I'm a successful executive. I'm seeing everything that I need to see. And then all of a sudden, everything switched to full Technicolor. You know, that spot in The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to full Technicolor, that's like what I've been experiencing. And all of a sudden I see there's been these deep greens and rich purples that I wasn't even aware of before, and they've been around me all the time. That's what it's like when we start tapping into how our filters are deciding for us. Now, what's the last stage? When we can actually shift our filters and respond differently. So what do we need to do to get there? What's our next developmental strategy? We got to practice doing that. Practice that filter shifting. That gets us into adaptation. Here you got the cheetah embracing change and taking action, putting on the Adidas to catch the gazelle. Basically to say that this is not assimilation. This is about shifting my filters to be more effective. And I don't do this in every situation, just in those where it can make me more effective. There's no developmental strategy here because this, of course, is the last of stages. But just a couple more things about this model. First of all, one of the things that's measured in the IDI assessment is this notion of a perception of where we are versus our actual development. And you might be surprised at the percentage of us that have a significant gap between these two. Almost 99% of us. It's striking, which means we've got blind spots and we've got to do this work to be more effective. We already mentioned that typically only about 10 to 15% of us are operating in those higher effective stages. So you might wonder, well, why do these circles get bigger then if there's fewer of us in them? It's essentially about more that we can respond to more effectively. The farther along we move in this continuum, the more effective we become and the more of the rich complexity of differences that becomes available to us. So wanted to show you, especially for those of you that are going to be getting your own individual IDI assessment and seeing your individual results, wanted to show you a typical group profile and what you will see also in your own individual results. Here's that perception skills gap that I talked about. And this from a group that we worked with recently, which is very, very, very typical. First of all, what you see again is that perception, where they think they are versus where they actually are. And a huge gap, a gap of over 24 points. In this particular assessment, this particular measure, a significant gap is 7 points or more. And it's very typical for folks to have a gap of around 20 to 25%. So that means we really have a lot of work to do to get to where we want to be. Now, most folks at this point say, okay, well, so how do I do this development work? Well, ask any cultural competence expert and they'd say, well, you got to do 40 hours of intentional development work. You know, one day talk about the culture of the rural South, another day talk about the culture of the generations, and you know, if you do that for 40 hours, folks will develop. And they do. We did that process for years, and they do develop. But what I started to realize is that there were some patterns in some key developmental shifts that people made as they developed, and particularly as they moved from minimization into acceptance. And so I thought, well, what if we would teach those key developmental shifts? And when we did, we moved that process from 40 hours down to just 9. That process is our filter shift process, where we start with a see self, then see others, and see approach. It's the process that I lay out in my book, and I go into a whole lot more detail, obviously, there, of those key developmental shifts that fall within each of these areas. 2 to 3 of them in each area. So we start with, what are my filters? Then move to, what are the filters of others? And then finally, can I see how I could be approaching things differently to be more effective? So just a couple more pieces that I want to share with you before we take your questions. And the first is really about what this process, using this framework helps us to see. First of all, as we've been talking over and over again, that it's about our effectiveness. And when we're having challenges with diversity and inclusion in our organizations, many times we can just look to, what's the stage of development for their effectiveness, and how do we move to higher performance? We also can target our work. Go back to that Cinco de Mayo example. We don't want to be doing those kinds of events and activities. So what does our organization specifically need to get us to a place where we're more effective? The other thing I think that's so helpful, and particularly in the field of diversity and inclusion, we come across resistance so much. And this model helps us to see when that resistance is coming from polarization. You're asking me to change, it's a good, bad SM, I don't like it. Then if that's where it's coming from, we respond differently than if it's coming from the gap, that perception skills gap, where folks might say, well, I don't really need this, I'm good. That's a very different kind of resistance, and then we can respond to those differently. I love talking about that piece because, particularly if any of you in the webinar are diversity and inclusion practitioners and you're dealing with resistance, I love going through that because we can really pick apart, where's it coming from, and then how do we respond more effectively to move folks out of that resistance. Wanted to give you also just a few ways that other organizations, after they have developed as an organization or as a group, they've developed their cultural competence, what have been some of the changes that they've seen? Well, some you might imagine, and it might be kind of the easy suspects. Well, they're going to have more diversity. Yeah. One organization, their diversity hire for a particular hiring group that went through the similar process, that went from 6% hires of successful diverse candidates up to 36%. Another that's my kind of more typical suspect is to have more culturally competent organizational values, those values that actually aren't biased. Even others that, let's step outside of the world of those things that you might kind of typically think about them as in the world of diversity, but ways that cultural competence development we've seen in specific organizations, things that has helped for them. One is in mergers and acquisitions. So bringing together two cultures and knowing how to do that effectively, knowing how to select those values in the organization, and really knowing how to bring folks along. Another is in marketing, targeting marketing to specific groups and doing that in a much more complex way versus just, oh, we're just going to translate the materials and put some different color faces on them. Because that actually is an approach from minimization. Finally, though certainly not finally in all of the results we've seen, but that I'll mention for you today, one particular organization that actually looked at their budgeting process completely differently after doing a cultural competence development. So much more that we could talk with you about, and so many more case studies, and we'd be happy to share those with you. You can contact us at Deep Sea if you want any of those case studies. But for now, let's take some of those questions. So Nick, do you have any questions that have been, that folks have been sending in?
I am about to send you an email with all of them in there. I think for right now, I think that I sent a few through chat, so we'll go over those.
All right, wonderful. The ones you sent through chat. And, the other thing too, I see, okay, I'm looking at Janine Rios. Rios, I'm assuming, Janine, and I can't quite read that. These are maybe comments. I don't know if you can see these, Nick, and you can read them. Knowledge, understanding, compassion, you said, Janine, and that is America right now, thanks to Trump. I'm assuming, Janine, you might have mentioned that when I was talking about polarization. That is one of the things that we tend to, folks tend to point out. They recognize that. But let's just go over some of those other questions. I'll just do a couple of them since we're really short here on time. And this one we hear quite a bit, actually. Can I be in different stages at the same time? And do I move back and forth between stages? Is another way that I hear other folks state that. And actually, no. Typically, you have a particular stage of development, and that's really where you're operating from. Think about it as a level of competence, and that's pretty much when you're approaching a situation where you're going to be at. So typically we don't see folks moving up and down, and also don't see regression all that much. Another here that is, hearing me talk about both individual and organizational, what is this? I would say it is both. It actually is both. This is a process for all of us as individuals to become more effective. All of us as individuals to become our most effective selves, and particularly in our interactions across difference, and be able to get ahead of the negative interference of our unconscious. When we do that, though, we can help, especially when we get a critical mass in an organization. And that's the process that we frequently do, is to develop this competence in organizations so that as organizations can be operating in those fourth and fifth stages and actually be more effective. So with that, I know we probably have more questions, but we're going to have to close because we've reached our time. I just want to say thank you to everyone that has been able to join us today. And thank you for those that are able to log in when we archive this. Once again, please do contact us at Deep Sea if you have questions or if you would like more information about how we use cultural competence for both individuals and organizations. Thank you very much, and do join us in our next webinar.